Welcome to the art and science method to nailing the execution PM interview. Thanks for watching the nailing the product sense portion of this. Now we'll go through how to nail the execution portion. First, I want to call out two execution interview myths that I often hear from people prepping. First is that the execution interview is less important than product sense. And second, that it's easier or more intuitive. Unfortunately, I found that neither of these are the case. The execution interview is just as important as the product sense interview, with each interview being equally weighted. Second, I find more people actually are caught off guard from the execution interview relative to product sense, because many of us tend to think, well, I'm a strong executor at work, or I'm pretty analytical. But regardless of how analytical you are, or how many years of experience you have, I urge you to take this just as seriously. We're going to take just as deep of a look at execution as we did at product sense. And I'm going to walk you through what I think is, again, the most efficient and highest quality way of preparing for the execution interview. So forget about all of the other resources out there, and please trust me with your preparation. In doing so, I hope to save you a ton of time by giving you the most solid foundation and eliminating a lot of the noise, and ultimately give you the best chance of landing the PM job that you're aiming for. All right, let's get started. The art and science PM method to nailing the execution interview. In terms of mindset, I need you to think today less about getting to the so-called right answer and more about shaping how you think about these questions. If you have the right mental framing, you should be able to tackle the vast majority of questions with ease. I'll also call out that a lot of the tips here are quite unique compared to the other prep resources out there. But trust me, I've pressure tested the approaches that I'm about to go through over years of prepping and hundreds of questions. And the reason I was motivated to create this series is because of how many people I realized were unprepared by the current PM interview prep resources out there. So hang with me. Let's talk about the main types of questions we're going to cover today. There are three main execution question types that Facebook and many other companies use in their execution interviews. So we're going to focus on how to nail these three question types. First, you have the pick your best metric question. This can be asked in a variety of ways, like, tell me what your North Star metric would be. How would you measure success? What are important metrics for this product, etc. Next, you have debugging. This is typically asked in the form of, you're the PM for X and you noticed Y metric dropped by Z%. How would you figure out what happened? And finally, you have the trade-off question. This is asked in a variety of ways and is often mistaken to be a free-form strategy question, but we'll talk more about that later. Now, unlike the product sense interview, you should think of these as three smaller questions that should each take about 15 minutes max to answer. Early on in your prep, it may be hard to complete each of these in 15 minutes, but I think you'll find that the advice I'll give you today, plus a bit of practice, will make everything much easier. And while these questions are often asked as standalone questions, it's very possible that they're also asked in order. For instance, they could ask, okay, you're the PM for Facebook Stories. Tell me what you would prioritize as your North Star metric. All right, let's say that metric dropped by 30% in the last week. How would you figure out what happened? Okay, now that you know what's driving that decrease, how would you think about this trade-off? Okay, with that, let's jump into the first question type. The first question type is pick your best metric. This can be asked in a few ways, but ultimately this question is trying to understand how you think about metrics. First, what not to do. A lot of people think about this question as simply, I'm going to list a bunch of metrics to prove to the interviewer that I can come up with metrics. Then I'll pick whatever one seems to be more important. The reason this mindset isn't good is that it misses the broader point of the interview, which is, again, understanding how you think about metrics. So you'll see that the following approach is far more focused on how you convey a logical approach to brainstorming a range of metrics, and then methodically narrowing in on the one that you think is the most important. I'm going to first list out the steps we'll cover, then go back and discuss each one in detail. You'll notice that the upfront steps to answering this question are very similar to if you were answering a product sense interview at the beginning. First, you want to get on the same page as the interviewer by clarifying what the question or product is as needed. Then give the interviewer a quick preview of what you're about to talk about. Next, you want to set the stage by grounding the interview in why we even care about this product, by stating the company mission, expounding a bit on how this product fits within that mission, and then stating the product mission. Then you want to get into the core of it, the metrics section. Here you can tell the interviewer the user types and categories of metrics you care about. Then brainstorm a metric or so per category. And then finally prioritize down based on which categories you think are most important for this product. And the last part, you want to wrap up the interview with final considerations, including downsides to the metric you chose and a summary of your answer. So let's get started with getting on the same page as the interviewer. The first step is to clarify as needed. Now, don't feel the need to ask questions just to ask questions. However, if I wasn't a user of the product, I may want to take a moment to clarify how the product works here. To help with an example, let's assume that you're asked, you're the PM for Facebook Stories. What would you say is your most important metric? Now, if I wasn't a user of Facebook Stories, I may say, okay, I'm not a regular user of Facebook Stories, so I just want to confirm that I understand how the product works. On the creation side, I can click the button at the top of Newsfeed and post a photo or video, which will then be shown to my friends for the next day. My friends can then view, react to, or comment on my story. Is that roughly right? Here, the interviewer will jump in if you aren't understanding the core functionality of the product. The second step is to give the interviewer a quick preview of what you're about to talk about. This signals to the interviewer that you're a structured thinker and a clear communicator. So for Facebook Stories, I would say, first, I'd like to set the stage by talking about the company mission and how this product fits into that. Then I'll talk through how I think about metrics, brainstorm a handful, and then select what I think is the most important metric. And finally, I'll discuss any downsides and wrap it up. Does that sound good to you? Now that we're on the same page as the interviewer, let's set the stage for why the company cares about this product. The third step is to state the company mission. This may seem low value, but it really grounds the interview and makes you appear principled in your thinking. You can keep this simple though, so just rattle off the company mission in 5 seconds or so. So for Facebook Stories, I would say, first, I think it's important to state what Facebook's mission is, since this product should be in service of that mission. Facebook's mission is to build community and bring people closer together. The fourth step is to expound on why the company mission relates to the product being discussed. This can be informal, off-the-cuff thoughts, and is really just a bridge to the next step, which is stating a product mission. So for Facebook Stories, I would say, Facebook Stories is a pretty clear fit within Facebook's mission of bringing people together. Since Facebook Stories is lightweight and higher frequency, it seems to be a pretty great way to bring people together on a daily basis, keeping your friends and family up to date with all of the little things in your life. Fifth, we want to converge onto a simple product mission. Now, don't worry about this being a perfect mission statement. Instead, just try to summarize your thoughts into a sentence that seems reasonable and is high level enough that it doesn't box you into which metric you'll need to choose. So for Facebook Stories, I would say, given Facebook Stories helps people stay up to date with each other's lives on a daily basis, I'm going to say that Facebook Stories' mission is to bring people together through daily moments. Okay, let's move into the core of the response now, the metrics. The sixth step is to call out the types of users and categories of metrics that are possible to track. The reason it's important to talk about this before listing out potential metrics is, again, that we're trying to tell the interviewer how we think about metrics. So the first thing I would call out is that there are different sides and therefore different user types in this ecosystem. Typically, there are creators and there are consumers, and both are important to track with metrics. Second, I would call out that there are 3 important types of metrics for any product: adoption, engagement, and retention. Now, you'll have noticed that I basically am painting a table in the mind of the interviewer of 2 columns and 3 rows. This is important because I'm framing up a very methodical way to brainstorm metrics for any product. So for Facebook Stories, I would say, before we jump into specific metrics, I'd like to call out the different metrics that we could track. First, it's important to note that there are 2 different sides to this ecosystem. There are creators and consumers. Both sides are vital to this product working. And second, when I think about types of metrics, I think about 3 core types for any product: adoption, engagement, and retention. And all are super important for a healthy product. Now that we've laid out the range of important metrics for a product, we can now brainstorm 1 to 2 metrics per box, depending on how you're doing with time. Here, the key is brainstorming really simple, pure metrics in each of these 6 boxes. Very few people do this. So let's go through what this means. For adoption, in its simplest, purest form, this means the number of people using this product. For creators, this would be the number of people who create per day, week, or month, depending on which time frame you think is more appropriate. For consumers, this could be the number of people who view your product per day, week, or month. Now, we're going to need to spend more time on engagement because this is the trickiest one to stay simple with. Engagement in its simplest, purest form is the percentage of users who meet a specific bar, having either taken a specific action or met a threshold of engagement, or an average level of engagement per user. So for creators, some metrics could be the percentage of creators who create a story with a poll per day, the percentage of creators who create more than X stories per week, or the average number of stories created per creator per day. For consumers, some metrics could be the percentage of consumers who view X or more stories per day, the percentage of consumers who react to a story per day, the percentage of consumers who comment on a story per day, etc. Before we move on, I want to call out that unlike the others, you can come up with tons of engagement metrics. Essentially, any action that a user could take within the funnel can be tracked, and it can be tracked as the percentage of users who've taken that action, the percentage of users who've taken the action X number of times or more, or the average number of times a user takes the action. So for Stories consumers, I could list tons of metrics along the funnel and many permutations of those metrics. I could track the number of times people view, react, share, respond to a poll, comment, report, send an emoji, etc. But remember, this question is all about coming up with important metrics. So while it's tempting to list out 20 engagement metrics, make sure to instead focus your mind on what you think are the most important metrics. To identify the most important engagement metric, I like to ask myself a question that cuts out all of the noise, which is, what bar would a user need to clear for me to consider them engaged? Now, when you think about it this way, you start to think about the most important action or actions that you want a user to take. So for Facebook Stories creators, I could argue that the bar that I would want to set for creators would be to create 3 or more stories per week. This would indicate to me that they're a regular creator. So I would track the percentage of creators that create 3 or more stories per week. For Stories consumers, I may argue that the best way to bring people closer together is for consumers to react or comment on a creator story. So I would track the percentage of consumers who react or comment on a story per day. So when it comes to brainstorming engagement metrics, you should ask yourself, what bar would a user need to clear for you to consider them engaged? And finally, we have retention. Retention in its simplest form is what percentage of people used this product last period who also used it this period. So for creators, I could track what percentage of people created last month who also created this month. And for consumers, I could track what percentage of people consumed last week who also consumed this week. Okay, to illustrate this for Facebook Stories, I would say, okay, Now let's brainstorm metrics across creators and consumers for adoption, engagement, and retention. First, for creator adoption, I would track the number of people who create a story per week, since I think creation is not always a daily use case. For consumer adoption, I would track the number of people who view a story per day, since I think consumption is more of a daily use case. For creator engagement, we could track a bunch of different actions that a creator could take in the funnel. But if I had to set a bar for what I would consider an engaged creator, I would say that from personal experience, if a creator is creating stories multiple times a week, then they're a regular stories creator. So let's say that our metric would be the percentage of creators who create 3 or more stories per week. For consumer engagement, again, we could track a bunch of different actions that consumers could take. But if I had to jump to what I think are the more important engagement metrics, I would first want to track whether people are engaging with the story's creators through either reactions or comments. This is, after all, core to the story's mission of bringing people closer together. So I would track the percentage of people who react or comment on a story. But I'd like to call out that some people are just not commenters at their core, and instead they prefer to just view people's updates. So for these viewers, I'd also like to set a bar for engagement that they could clear too. So I'll also track the percentage of people who view 10 or more stories per day, since again, from my experience, it's pretty quick to tap through 10 people's stories in a day. For creator retention, I think it's important to see whether people are coming back month to month. So I would track the percentage of people who created a story last month who also created a story this month. And similarly for consumer retention, I would track the percentage of people who viewed stories last month who also viewed stories this month. Okay, I'm going to pause there for a second to note a couple of things. First, you see how simple and pure each of these metrics are. The adoption metrics are very simply the number of people using the product. The engagement metrics are simply setting a bar for what we would consider an engaged user and tracking what percentage of adopted users are clearing this bar. And finally, retention is dead simple. Second, I'd like to call out that we just listed out 7 metrics that cover the range of potential metrics that are important for a product. This shows the benefit of first describing the user types and categories of metrics that you think are important prior to brainstorming metrics, because then you end up being far more intentional about which metrics you brainstorm. Before we move on to the next step of prioritizing, I want to call out a warning on what I often see people do, which is called combination metrics.